All right, so we are live. Welcome everybody to our guest lecture, our first guest lecture of the month. And it's a great pleasure and a good honor to introduce Christian Tobler.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Thanks very much, Devin and company for inviting me to do this. I love doing this sort of thing, so it's a great opportunity. And just a little bit extended invitation, just in case you didn't read my bio. I have been researching German combatives for over 20 years and am multiply published, including a couple of instruction videos. And I've taught all over the place, including having the honor and privilege of teaching several times at this per Devin's invitation. So it's good to talk to Duello students. And I'll start sharing the presentation momentarily, but just give you a little upfront about what I'm going to show you. This is kind of an overview of the tradition that I generally work within, which is the Liechtenauer tradition of late medieval and early Renaissance German fighting. And I'm going to pretty much give you a little bit of backdrop and kind of go on a little bit of a tour of the manuscripts to show you the diverse sources that I work with to do my research and provide the material that I teach to my students and providing for our various chapters around the country. Okay, so I'm going to go to share. And where are we over here? And let's go to the beginning. All right, the knightly art of Master Johannes Leichtenauer. And there may be a couple little kinks in the presentation, things are a little awkward. This is a presentation I originally put together quite some years ago. And when I told Devin, oh yeah, I've got one of these already in my back pocket, you can just pull out. I went to review it and I was like, oh goodness, there's a bit of out-of-date stuff here. So I hustled in the last few days to bring it as up-to-date as possible, but there may be a couple places where I say, ignore the man behind the curtain, that applies to my people. All right, so off we go. I think there's an echo, so if somebody could go on mute. Okay. All right, so the Liechtenauer tradition, along with that of Fiore de Liberi and his inheritors, is one of our earliest documented fighting traditions. The only one that we can say for sure is earlier than either of those is the 133 Tower Fechtbuch. Fechtbuch is German for fight book, which is a sword and buckler manuscript. I have circa 1300 here. There's a lot of debate about really how old that thing is. Some say 1290, some say as late as 1330, but suffice to say it's earlier than most of the material that either of our schools focuses on. There's a manuscript or manuscripts that are whispered about in dark alleys, purportedly arising from the three Del Serpente brothers who were active in the 13th century. Whether there's really a manuscript that survives any place or not, no one knows. It may be a ghost. But it's fun to talk about, especially, you know, if you're a Harry Potter head, you know, there's the three brothers. So, you know, maybe one of them had, you know, the Elder Sword or something like that. But so far, that's a ghost. What we have surviving that's before any of our other stuff is this sword and buckler manuscript. So let's talk about Johannes Leichtenauer, the progenitor of this tradition. I would love to give you a full and exciting biography, but this man is a very shadowy figure, and we only know anything about him via what his follow-on disciples and people commenting on his works have to say about him. According to at least one source, he is a synthesist. He traveled and studied with various masters and then synthesized the system that he then passed on to his students and the masters that would follow in his footsteps. I'm going to say here he probably lived in the 14th century because our earliest surviving material from this tradition is either very late 14th century or more likely early 15th. And it seems to be at a time when he has already passed. He casts a very long shadow. His tradition in one form or another survives for a good 250 plus years in, of course, having some changes as it goes. And I'm going to roll out a word here to describe really his role in all of this. There's a word that is used in scholastic circles in the Middle Ages referring to someone as an auctor. And an auctor is an authority figure who writes some fundamental material that others then graft their own onto, almost like accreting onto the core that they create. And Liechtenauer is an excellent example of an auctor in that we have his base teachings that I'll talk about, and then we have the work that is done by other masters following in his footsteps that explain what he is talking about in better ways and also add their own material onto it. Well, talking about Liechtenauer himself and what he left to us, we can definitively say that he left 3 specific disciplines of fighting, primarily centered around the longsword, but with some additional things in there too. And in German, these 3 disciplines are known as Blossfechten, Rossfechten, and Harnischfechten. Blossfechten basically translates to exposed or open fighting. It is fighting with the longsword without the protection of any kind of armor. And I've chosen some examples from one of the manuscripts from a master we'll talk about a little bit later named Paulus. And so we have an example of some unarmored longsword fighting at upper left. And this is the largest part of the treatise. And at this part, I want to let you know that it's a good thing we have the works of other masters and not just what we can assign to Liechtenauer himself, because Liechtenauer only wrote in cryptic verse. We have some 350 couplets of verse that he left us for these 3 disciplines, and they are written in a way to obscure the meaning of his teachings. Fortunately, as we'll see in a little bit, we have other masters of the tradition taking these verses and explaining what they are all about. And Blossfechten is the first thing that's presented, is the largest body of teachings. And then essentially the fighting on horseback, Rossfechten, Ross is another word in German for horse, takes those basics and then gives you specifics of what do I have to do to make this work on horseback. Now, we should be a little careful here. He gives us the techniques. He does not tell us how to control or ride a horse. So 90% of what would be involved in making these things work on horseback would, of course, require excellent horsemanship, as Jen Landels could very clearly tell you. The final sub-treatise within the treatise, if you will, is Harnischfechten, which is fighting in armor on foot. Now, Rossfechten and Harnischfechten are very related to each other in that they both speak to the late medieval forms in Germany of judicial and sometimes extrajudicial dueling. And these were constrained by rules, constrained in what kind of location or what size location they could be fought in, considerable ritual behind them. But many of these duels could begin on horseback, hence the Rossfechten, and then if one or more were unhorsed, continue with the techniques for fighting in armor on the ground, Harnischfechten. You can see in the Harnischfechten illustration I have here that the sword is no longer being swung with both hands on the hilt. Rather, it could be swung like a small poleaxe by the blade, using the cross guard or the pommel as concussive instruments. Or the left hand can be released from the hilt to grab the middle of the blade, turning the sword into a short and very precise thrusting spear. And this is a pretty important advantage to have with the sword, because you're not going to cut through the very fine plate armor of the day. You instead are going to need to concentrate on using the point in as precise a fashion as possible to seek out the gaps in the armor. So that's why we see these 2 seemingly exotic grips on the sword at right. Here's a list, and I'm going to kind of breeze through this because I'm going to touch on some of them a bit later as we go. We are confident that we can say a very early source for the material is from the early 15th century. There are some scholars that debate that one, the so-called Derbringer manuscript, is from the late 14th century. For reasons that I'm not going to fully geek out on today, I'm pretty darn confident it is not 14th century, that it is in fact sometime from at least the first half of the 15th. We have commentaries by masters Sigmund Ringneck, Peter von Danzig. We're going to look at some illustrated works by masters Hans Talhofer, Paulus, Another set of commentaries associated with a master named Yud Lev, Lev the Jew. Interestingly, we do find Jewish masters of this tradition. The fairly famous handbook or treatise on fighting with the Messer, we'll talk about what a Messer is, by Hans Leichtenauer. That's built off of Liechtenauer's teachings, but adapted to that. And one of my favorites, the Peter Faulkner illustrated Fechtbuch, we'll look at that. We'll touch a little bit on what the tradition looks like in the 16th and 17th centuries. And I'll talk about a couple of things too that may or may not be related directly to the treatise, to the Liechtenauer tradition, or might be their own little sub-traditions. And that too is open to some debate. I'm going to say, by the way, any time if you have a question, please blurt out and interrupt me. We don't have such a large group that that's impractical, so I'm happy to stop and address a specific point. All right, so I talked about how Liechtenauer himself has left us this verse, and fortunately we have these other masters following his footsteps who are glossing the verse. They are giving us explicatory text to explain what the master is talking about. And I've included a sample here, and what this says in the red at top is this is about the krumpau. The krumpau is a specific strike done with the longsword where the hands cross to deliver the blow. The specific physicality of that is not too important for our purposes today. So that's the heading there, and then it begins and it says, and I'll say this in English, strike crooked, quickly to throw the point on the hands. And it goes on with some more verse, and then you'll see about a third of the way, between a third and a half of the way down, you'll see the word glossa, G-L-O-S, that little squiggly guys, and S-A. And that tells us that's where the explanation is going to begin. And then this particular master goes on to say, you know, here note and know that the krumpau is a strike from above that is done, you know, with a good step out and with crossed hands, and goes on and on and on to explain how do you actually do this thing that this secret encrypted verse is talking about. So we have the verse and we have the gloss, which is the explanation. Now the verse has a purpose above and beyond just trying to make this a bunch of secretive gobbledygook. It actually is a memory aid. All of the verse rhymes. I will tell you, as poetry goes, it is nothing short of awful, but it's not meant to be good poetry. It's meant to be something that's easy to remember. Now, many of you are probably too young to remember this, but when I was a child and we were being taught about early American history, and back before Christopher Columbus had quite the evil name he has in some circles these days, we all learned this little ditty. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And once you've heard that stupid bad bit of poetry, you never forget it. Well, the verse from Liechtenauer acts in much the same way. It's a way to, it's got meter to it, and it has rhyme. So it's an easy way to encode complex data without having to remember hundreds and hundreds of paragraphs of the actual explanation of it. Now, Liechtenauer's treatise overall is known as the Zettel. And Zettel is not a word that's really used much in modern German. When it is, it usually means a schedule. In Liechtenauer's time, that word would have meant the epitome or the register or the notes, something like that. It's a loose title for what that's all about. And again, as I said, you know, there's this rhyming verse for all three of those disciplines. This is for the unarmored longsword here. Just kind of going to show how this theme occurs over and over. This is material by Master Sigmund Ringek. This is actually the same set of passages I just looked at before. And the so-called Ringek Fechtbuch, and again, Fechtbuch is Fechtbuch, is actually 15th century material, but the copy we have surviving of it is really someplace right around the turn of the 15th into the 16th century. And Ringek's commentaries address all three of Liechtenauer's main disciplines. That particular manuscript also includes some anonymous sections on wrestling some sword and buckler material, and unfortunately, the Rossfechten, the fighting on horseback, is incomplete in that copy. Fortunately, we have other manuscripts. This is a particularly excellent one. This one we can very firmly date by the scribe's own dating to 1452. And this is the so-called Peter von Danzig manuscript. It is a compilation of the works of several masters, starting off with a very substantial set of anonymous commentaries, anonymous glosses on all three of Liechtenauer's disciplines. Really, I think the best copy of any of the commentaries. Then goes in to include sword and buckler, wrestling, dagger, and some armored combat from a master Anders Lignitzer. It's a name we'll see again a little bit later. Armored combat, dagger, and mounted combat by a master Martin Hunfeltz, another name we'll see later. The much copied wrestling that derives from a master known as the Jew. He was attached to the Austrian Archducal Court. And then finally, and the reason why the manuscript is given this name, is there is a separate additional commentary on Liechtenauer's armored combat by Peter von Danzig himself. Well, so he gets this last section. Why name the whole manuscript after him? Well, because he's the only one in 1452 who isn't dead. All the other masters mentioned in each of their little sections all have the little note saying, God have mercy on him. It is a note that they have passed, and hopefully that they are in the bosom of the Lord. Peter von Danzig, as of 1452, seems to still be alive. Speaking of Peter von Danzig, it is not an illustrated manuscript, save for, if you remember, I had a little picture of Liechtenauer very early in the presentation. That is included in this manuscript, as is this picture of the 4 primary guards for fighting unarmored with the longsword. And these are from left to right: Flug, which means the plow, and you kind of imagine the blade furrowing its way through the earth. Ox, which is spelled differently, but sounds the same as ox in English. And the sword is held aloft, threatening with the point, like the horn of an ox. At right, we have 2 open words, seemingly vulnerable ones: vom Tag, which means either from the roof or from the day. Those are similar words in Old German, but this idea of holding the sword high is implied in both senses. And this is the primary cutting guard used in the system. And then Alber at right, which is a guard held low, seemingly exposing the entire body, but with the intent of luring an opponent in with a false sense of security. And there's all sorts of ways to strike up from there, to deflect the sword, and rush into grapple, and all sorts of other nasty things. This is yet another example, that same passage. This is from a compendium in 1460, associated with a master Lev, referred to as Yud Lev, Lev the Jew. Another compendium, several different masters' works in there, including commentary on Liechtenauer, probably right around 1460, as far as we can tell from the handwriting. And then very late in the century, yet another illustration of the text to the verse and a gloss attached to it. Also, that same technique from the Krumpau we talked about before. This compendium is firmly dated to 1491. And so really there's 4 main glosses, 3 of which are very similar. The von Danzig one, the von Speer that we're looking at here, the Yud Lev one, and then Ringek's gloss is a little different, but a lot of overlap in wording nonetheless. So let's look at some illustrated manuscripts in the tradition. Hans Talhofer was one of the first masters of the German school of fighting to be well known to modern American audiences with the publication of Mark Rector's Medieval Combat, where he translated Talhofer's 1467 manuscript. That's probably his latest one. This is the earliest one from 1443. And we see here one of these judicial duels that I was speaking about to go into progress. We see the entry into the lists of judges and assistants accompanying one of the fighters. At the right side, that other page there, we see the duel getting underway, beginning with a casting of the spear by the opponent on the left, and it being deflected by the opponent on the right. Now, one might wonder, why would you bother beginning a duel against so armored an opponent by throwing a spear at them? Well, as far as we can tell, this is actually a migration era tradition that lasted in Germanic dueling for centuries upon centuries. That being that the party that was the accuser must cast something to begin the fight. They have to throw something. And there's a little bit of a comical version of that I'll talk about a little bit later, where it's sort of obey the letter of the law, but not the spirit. We'll talk about that in a bit. Here we have a circa 1450 manuscript, also by Talhofer. And again, he's showing some preparation for the duel. You can see between these two, the armor is changing. So armor is evolving, and this is the latest up-to-date stuff for 1450. It's starting to look a little bit more like the famous Gothic armors from made in Germany in the 1470s through 1490s. But starting to get a bit of that line there. This is an assistant on the left. It's actually supposed to be Talhofer himself that is arming his patron. In this case, the patron that commissioned this manuscript was a nobleman named Leuthold von Koenigsegg. And people have looked at this and said, well, I can't find any evidence of duels fought by this character. We know this noble's history very well, and yet we can't find a judicial duel. Well, I think that is because the duel is a theoretical. It is Talhofer providing instruction to him. You know, if you have a dispute with a noble and you have to go fight one of these, this is how that's done. And there's some pretty good evidence for why that might be the case here. You will note kind of a grim reminder of how the duel is likely to carry out. Here are the two opponents with their standard bearers holding their flags. And what do we see in the backdrop of the lists? Their coffins. So somebody's going in one of those boxes. Now, if you look at the left side, and it says in upper left in German, here sits Leuthold von Koenigsegg, and you can see his heraldic arms drawn out at the bottom. But over on the right, all it says at top is, here's his opponent, and there is no coat of arms there. That's because this is a theoretical opponent. This is not a particular person. And Talhofer kind of takes this whole setup of this theoretical duel that you should be prepared to do and anonymizes it in all the cases he shows it. Well, off we go for our duel. You can see both spears have been cast at this point. At left, the one thrown by the guy at right is being deflected with the sword. And the guy at right has grasped his sword into that half sword grip where he's got the left hand upon the blade and is about to rush in and start thrusting with the weapon. Things get hot and hairy here. Very close quarters combat now beginning to happen at left, with each of them trying to seek out gaps in the armor. Now, I want you to notice something. Does anybody notice something odd about the hands on the left side? Feel free to chime in if you. Okay, well, I'll give it away then. They're not wearing gauntlets.
They look unarmored, yeah.
Well, okay. So it turns out they actually are wearing gauntlets. This is an artistic convention because showing detailed movement, drawing that with a gauntleted hand, is a lot harder artwork to do than just drawing fingers without the armor. What happens though is that if a technique absolutely requires showing the gauntlets, as we see in the image at right, the gauntlets are shown. Now, this is a described technique in various German sources where you thrust inside the gauntlet through the back of the cuff of the gauntlet. So we have to see that drawn on the victim of the technique. Well, we don't need to see it on the guy doing it, so the artist is continuing to cheat on the right and not show them there. But in order to get the gist of where that sword point is going, we have to see the gauntlets here. And you can see they're not really rendered in tremendous detail either. This is a little warning about when you go to interpret medieval art. You can't look at it as if it is a photorealistic thing that we would expect if we did a how-to manual today and used photography to do it. Neither can we expect to see an instant of time. The idea of seeing an instant, a snapshot of time, is a completely modern construct arising from our ability to capture time in a box with photography. Well, these things don't usually end very nicely. Sometimes nobles break them up because honor has been served and there's been enough violence. This is one that terminates with our victor finding a gap in the armor underneath the neck defense, jamming his dagger there, and then prying the helmet up to finish the job. Yeah, with quite a bit of blood and gore shown to drive the point home here. Now, there's no sense in leaving all that good armor on the field. So we see our victor gets up, and Talhofer rather dryly notes, here he looks to check and see if his opponent is dead. And then at right, we see the armor being stripped from the loser. The loser of the duel is then put in their respective coffin. And then finally, at right, we see Leuthold von Koenigsegg, the victor of his theoretical duel, thanking God or Christ for his victory. Now, by the way, this particular set of images I have is from a copy of this fight book, still dating from the 15th century, but a copy in Vienna of one that is still in the Koenigsegg family collection in their castle. And that's why you see that little banderole there, that scroll that the victor is kind of holding, is blank. When the copy was made of the original manuscript, those banderoles were not filled in with text. This same manuscript has a bit of dagger fighting. It's rather nice here. Talhofer actually explains some guards for fighting with the dagger. The first one, this is the thrust above. This is the inverted thrust, and that's one from below, but also with that ice pick grip on the dagger. Then there's the third one, which is a thrust from below with a forward grip. And then he has a last one with both hands on the dagger optimized for compromising gaps in the armor. Remember, those gaps in the armor are still going to have bits of mail armor likely in them. So if you're going to thrust with a short-ish weapon, you're going to want to drive considerable power to compromise the mail, or at least compress it enough to still do damage beneath it. Now, Talhofer, even though he's a little bit of a maverick and kind of creating his own spin on the tradition, still feels obligated to show he is a true student of Liechtenauer's art. So in the next of his manuscripts from 1459, and this one has really quite nice artwork, he takes the pains to have an exposition of Liechtenauer's verse. And again, here's that same bit on the Krumpau, the crooked stroke, talked about before. This manuscript treats a number of different disciplines: on horse, on foot, some longsword, wrestling, sword and buckler, the very exotic dueling shield that we'll talk about a bit, and a type of peasant duel we'll look at, and some messer and dagger work as well. Here's that same kind of duel, beginning with the spear cast. So here we very clearly can see, wasn't Leuthold having a duel. This is Talhofer's boilerplate stuff he teaches for armored combat. And we can find Liechtenauer's verse that address these very, very specific things Talhofer is illustrating. You can see the artwork is really quite nice. We're getting, it's 1459 now, again, very firmly dated manuscript. And we are starting to look even more like the famous Gothic armors that are in museums in New York, Vienna, Munich, etc. Talhofer includes quite a bit of sword and buckler material. These are very gruesome bucklers he has. This kind of shape is shown in a number of German manuscripts, but Talhofer goes the extra mile and puts these nasty spikes onto the face of the bucklers as well. Now, here's something we see in a number of German duels. There's even some evidence to suggest that at least two of these happened. This is a fight between a man and a woman. And there's some different wrinkles on how this is shown. We'll see a slightly different variation on this a bit. But the general form is the man is given a club, but is forced to stand disadvantaged in a pit up to his waist. The woman is given either an extension to her sleeve that holds a weight or a rock, or given some sort of a bag to put the rock in that she can swing flail-like. Now, why would this sort of thing happen? Well, probably these are accusations of some capital crime. Probably the woman has accused the man of rape, and maybe she is not believed, or for whatever reason, she is unable to secure a champion to fight this duel for her. So this crazy form of duel that presumably gives advantage to the woman who can freely move around the pit is structured this way. We have, there's some cryptic references in some chronicles suggesting this has actually happened a couple of times. Just really crazy stuff. The man seems to be on top of things here, but in some versions, the woman is actually beats him down pretty badly. You can see he's actually been hit in the forehead with the rock at some point here. So this is pretty ugly. There's Poleaxe fighting. Again, this is the artwork really here.
Christian, can I ask just a question about that?
Yeah.
The judicial duel. So do we know in what's been looked up about that, or this research about that, are those the two aggrieved parties, the man and the woman, in that duel context? Or
I don't think we know enough yet. This is source material, unfortunately, Devin, that I have not personally got to look at.
Right.
So it's a little unclear whether, and it may have varied too. One thing we'll talk a little bit about is just how much regional variation some of these dueling rituals could have behind them.
Right.
even between next door neighbor counties. So
right. Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Here's some Poleaxe fighting. This was some of the source material used for my DVD on fighting with the Poleaxe. Apologies for the commercial interruption there. Once we get to, wow, I really should update these images. I have much better images of this now. This is images from Taloffer's most famous manuscript, at least most famous today, the 1467 one. The last one we believe was created under his guidance. There are copies made of them later on. And there's a very considerable section on longsword fighting technique out of armor. Dagger fighting, this is similar to what we saw in the other manuscript. A couple pairs of techniques here. The first one's a disarm. The second is just a setup for one about to stab from above and the other to set it aside from below. I love the little prelude there. Here they take up the dagger. God preserve us all. Leaving Taloffer, I'd like to talk now about, this was a subject of another book I did. This is the very beautifully illustrated fight book by Master Paulus. Kyle's interesting in that we have a lot of data about him, and he is much more close to the mainstream of the Liechtenauer tradition than Taloffer. Taloffer strays a little bit more in creating his own identity, his own techniques. Cal seems to be much more of a traditionalist. Now, what's happening here, this is an early plate in the book, and this is Paulus Cal himself pledging military service to Duke Ludwig IX of Bavaria, who was known as Ludwig the Rich. He was one of the wealthiest nobles in 15th century Germany. And he is, again, taking Cal's hand, accepting his service. And it says here in the caption, "Gentle Lord, I pledge my service to you. Pray that God and his loving mother shall help us." And you can see that the colors are absolutely vivid for something created in around 1470. So a lot of money must have gone into creating this manuscript. Now, This manuscript begins by showing the judicial dueling material first, hewing very closely to the mounted combat and armored foot combat that is laid out in Liechtenauer's treatises and teachings. But also we'll see some other types of duels, as well as instructional sections showing Cal instructing students in longsword, messer, sword and buckler, dagger, and wrestling. There's quite a bit of bits of Liechtenauer's verse that are used to caption some of these illustrations. Now, one of the really cool things about Cal as well, did I include, no, I don't have that here. I really should add that. He has a page, which I neglected to put in here, where he lists masters of what he calls the Society of Liechtenauer. And we don't know if that was an actual organization or if he's just using that to indicate a fellowship that exists among people that went on to be teachers of this art. He lists a number of the instructors, the masters we talked about earlier from some of the compendia, like Martin Hundsfeld and Anders Lignitzer, Peter von Danzig, Sigmund Ringek. And Cal lists all those people, and then he mentions Ott the Jew, and then says, Master Stettner, who was the most masterly among the pupils and was my own master. You know, I, Paulus Cal, had been his pupil. It's a shame we don't have any surviving material from Cal's Master Stettner. At least we haven't found any surviving yet. Who knows what remains in the dusty books of private collections in Europe that we humble researchers have not had that access to yet. There's this very interesting diagram, this illustration in Paulus Cal's book. This is again towards the beginning of the book. And this is a bizarre and or comical illustration to our eyes, but given the lore that medieval readers would have understood about the symbolism of various animals, all of this would have made eminent sense. This human figure has the head of a bird. It's a falcon's head. And the scroll there says, I have eyes like a falcon so that I may not be fooled. It's hard to make out at this resolution, but over his heart is the emblem of a lion. And it says, I have a heart like a lion so that I strive forth. And then his legs terminate in deer hooves. And it says, I have feet like a hind. Hind is a female adult deer, so that I can spring towards and away. Well, really, these are qualities of an ideal fencer or fighter. The eyes of the falcon are judgment, being able to judge the opponent's intent, to not be fooled and deceived. The lion over the heart, well, you know, the lion is associated not only in the Middle Ages, but even still today with courage. So one must have courage, bravery to strive forth. And then finally, the hind's feet are agility or nimbleness. We have to be able to have good footwork, to be able to spring towards our opponent, spring away from them, to be light on our feet and agile as a deer is. And this is something, by the way, that my senior-most student, Jess Finley, uncovered to me. We had wondered for a while, why is it the hind? Why? Usually it's the stag that is seen in medieval lore. But the hind in hunting lore, German hunting lore in particular, was regarded as very devious in her footwork, that she would make very strange changes in track that would deceive a hunter in a way that a stag would not. So that's why it is the female, the adult female deer, and not the majestic stag with its huge rack of antlers. It is the deception of the hind that is key here. That's something that I've only known about thanks to Jess's wonderful research in the last year or so.
Christian, are there totemic figures like that in many of the Liechtenauer tradition manuals? Like I know we have in Fiore and Vadi, there are these also similar kind of ideas being shown. I just wasn't sure how prolific that was across the German traditions.
No, it seems to only be Paulus Cal's thing, which is really, really fascinating. You know, we see lots of references in text to animal qualities. There are, Lecutioner in his Messer treatise has gobs of these things. He's got the basilisk, he's got the scorpion, Obviously we see some animal symbolism in the four guards, the ox. Electrocutioner turns that into the steer, and then the aber, the boar. But yeah, this is the only master I know of that has this figure like this. It was one of the most striking things when I began researching this particular manuscript. So yeah, excellent question. Here we have some mounted combat, and this is a disarm done by hooking the pommel over the wrist of the opponent to either remove the sword from their hand, or if they don't let go of it, remove them from their saddle. That's a sword taking. By the way, sword taking is the term we see in German manuscripts, Schwerten nehmen, sword taking. The word disarm is not used. And I think that's because not any of these disarms always have the guarantee of the sword being relieved from the opponent's hands, but you are certainly seizing their sword. And if they don't let go of it, well, they're going to take a tumble. So if you end up doing any research in this stuff, bear in mind, you'll see that term Schwerten nehmen. You can see that up at top if you can read that at all. Das inner Schwerten nehmen, the inside sword taking. That's because you go inside their wrist to hook them. There's some poleaxe fighting. Again, one of my touchstones for the work I did with that in Paul's Cow. Here we see a hook at the back of the neck with the back beak of the poleaxe. I'm going to kind of spike something out. There's some interesting color coding that Paul's Cow does, and I think we can see in the previous image. I'll go back to that in a moment. You'll notice the figure at left has red straps on his armor, a red scabbard for sword and dagger, and the figure at right has all the leather bits all in tan. He's kind of color coding these guys. Is that true here too? Yes, I think it is. It's also true here. So yes, he's using the poleaxe to hook them. Now, an interesting note on the armor here. We back up and look at these guys. They're wearing very typical so-called Gothic German armor. Lots of flutes and swoopy stuff detailing and strengthening the surface of the plates. Once we get to the poleaxe, though, Paulus Cow has switched out his combatants to wearing what are known as great bassinets. And these are much more solid, weighty helmets and don't have provision for the helmet and the jaw defense, known as a bever, to potentially open up, creating a gap. Anybody that's done some poleaxe fighting can readily imagine, Devin, I'm sure you can chime in on this, that having a beefier helmet for that is a really good idea.
Yeah, I've taken a few good helmet hits. It definitely, you want something that can counteract the mass.
Yeah, well, this is definitely one of my future investments, because the older I get, the less likely I want my belt on.
Can I just ask something about the poleaxe quickly?
Yes, of course.
All right. Is there any evidence that that Liechtenauer like taught or worked with Poleaxe, or is the Poleaxe fighting that's in the later Fechtbuchs kind of like an extrapolation from his principles?
I think it's an extrapolation. Now, depending on how long, when Liechtenauer actually lived, the poleaxe may not have been that popular a weapon yet. And in fact, these longer ones we see here are manifestations of the mid to late 15th century. If you look at Fiore de Libri's poleaxe, it's quite short. Almost like it's just kind of a lengthened warhammer that would have been used on horseback. So these more dedicated, human height-sized ones are a later thing. So there's oblique mention of the staff in very early Liechtenauer sources, but not the axe. So yes, I would agree with your wording that it is an extrapolation. And I think we can say the same thing for the Messer that we're going to talk about in a bit too, and some other weapons. But the fundamental principles that Liechtenauer laid out remain in force. And if you look at these teachings in detail, that becomes apparent very quickly. Excellent question.
Thanks.
Here's some exotica now. These are specialized dueling shields And these appear in so many manuscripts, we cannot write them off as being some flight of fancy on the part of the Paul's cowl. I didn't show them when I was looking at Talhofer, but he has lots of material for fighting with these. And I was going to say before about how we have regional differences in, even in close proximity between locales for this kind of fighting. This is known as the Franconian rite. And it is done with, this judicial duel is done with obviously the huge man-height shields, but it is used with a mace-like club. There's an alternative version, and by the way, I should say, Franconia is an ancient German locale. It was all split up by the time of these books. But suffice to say, this would have been used in Bavaria, which is where Paulus cowl is based. And so it's used with the shield and club. There's another form that is the Swabian rite, used in the Duchy of Swabia, where the sword is used instead. And in some cases, you see masters showing both forms, kind of showing their potential patron that they understand local customary. Yes, I know the club is used in Bavaria. I know the sword is used in Swabia. Now, you can see this.
Christian, in Talhofer, he also shows those hooked dueling shields being used just alone, and they have the spikes like these do on the end. Do those show up in Cal as well? I can't remember.
Cal doesn't show, well, no, I take that back. Cal does show, I don't have a picture of it, but yes, Cal does actually have a place where the shield is used to thrust itself. Yeah. And these shields are shown in I don't know, 20 different configurations with variations on what kind of hooks and spikes are on them, variations in their shape. It's all over the map. I'm currently working with a new book I'm coming out with, where I cover the sword and shield fighting that's shown in a manuscript called Gladiatoria, which we'll show briefly in a little while. And there are 5 techniques for the sword and shield, and then another 5, including counter techniques, for just the shield swung by itself. So yes, we see the shield with the club, shield with the sword, shield by itself. We've actually done some fighting here with these shields, which is an incredible blast and also incredibly exhausting. It may be the only thing more exhausting than partisan and shield, Devin. Okay. So I said before, we see this man and woman crazy fight. This one is a variation, different than what Talhofer shows. They're not wearing these skin-tight outfits here. And we have a little bit more detail here too. So in this case, the woman is holding a 4-pound rock. It actually says specifically 4-pound stone in an extension of her chemise that she's stripped down to. You can see the chemise is kept from flapping about. There's a tie holding the skirting of it together between the legs, almost turning it into loose trousers. The man is forced to stand in the pit as before. He's only given a stick, not something that looks more like a mace. And it says in the text accompanying this that his left arm is loosely bound to his body. So he has very, very limited use of the left hand. Crazy stuff. Now, after Cal shows these duels, and by the way, they end pretty gruesomely. I didn't show the conclusion of them. I figured there was enough gore on the Talhofer side. It proceeds for him showing techniques with weapons, but these don't come to nasty ends. He's clearly showing instruction. And he starts off with the sword and buckler. Here you can see he is parrying a blow delivered to his head. That's Cal at the right. With looking like he has a healthy middle-aged paunch. Good to see he's well fed by his patron. And the guy on the left has this really wonderfully kooky buckler with the embossed face and the lolling tongue hanging out from it. The Cal is deflecting one blow and then striking low to the opponent's leg. Here we see our 4 guards for fighting unarmored with the longsword. Once again, Cal's rendition of them. Ox and Flug, shown at left, ox and plow in English. At right, Alber, the Fool's Guard, and Vamtag from the roof, shown at right. Curiously, he has shifted the handedness of the players at right. They're both fighting left-handed here. Hard to know why that is, other than just showing variation. But again, it's Paulus Cal in kind of a salmon-colored outfit on in both plays here.
Christian, do you think it is in the changing the handedness, is that again more of an iconographic desire where they're wanting to show the chests of the figures as opposed to their backs, and wanting them to maybe ordered, you know, and yet have them ordered in this way?
Well, that's an interesting. I didn't consider the ordering, but I thought about maybe, you know, preserving as much view of the body's positioning as possible. But yes, we did see there are compromises elsewhere in the ordering in order to achieve that. Perhaps that is a really good observation, Devin, because indeed Cal has preserved the canonical ordering that Liechtenauer has in the verse Ox Flug, Alber vom Tag, and maybe that is his reason for doing this. Alternatively, you know, Liechtenauer makes very, very brief mention of fighting left-handed, telling you what side you should start from depending on whether you're left or right-handed, but then really doesn't talk about it anymore after that. Maybe Cal is trying to give a little bit more nod to that variation here too, also a possibility. But yes, your idea is a compelling one. That's a wonderful thing about doing one of these things. It's invariably I come away learning several things from the speculations, questions, and comments of people attending. So thank you for that. It's wonderful that Cal has this plate. This is the first foremost play of the longsword, the Zornhau and a thrust that arises out of it. Zornhau means a stroke of wrath. And essentially what it is used to do is to break attacks from the opponent with the point. And it does this by countercutting into their strike and allowing that counter stroke to flow into a thrust to the face or chest. And Cal is really valuable for a lot of the postures he shows. The footwork he shows is actually pretty reliable. And you can see here he's really conservatively bringing the body forward. He's passing footwork, but he's not diving into it. He's got a lot of reserve here so that if he needs to drive further forward, he's got more left that he can do to shift the weight. So very conservative footwork he's showing here. That depiction of footwork that he shows that tends to be very accurate is very important in the wrestling and dagger, where if you don't study what he's showing, some of what he's picturing without paying attention to footwork becomes very difficult to interpret. Here he's showing the crooked stroke we talked about before. There's a little bit of wonkiness in how the arms are shown to drive home the idea that the arms or hands have to cross. So he's really stressing that point and you know, creating a picture that might not be entirely realistic in and of itself. But again, medieval artwork is symbolic artwork. He's showing us that the crossing of the arms or hands is imperative. And there's that same bit of Liechtenauer's verse capturing it. Strike crooked with nimbleness, throw the point to the hands. After quite a number of longsword plates, Cal has a brief catechism on fighting with the Messer. And this is independent of the extensive Messer treatise that Hans Leichtenauer would create shortly after this. So he has some just real boilerplate stuff. In this plate, Cal has bound against his opponent's Messer and then come out of the bind to cut very quickly down onto the opponent's wrist. Now again, if this was in the dueling section of the manuscript, we'd have some blood involved here, but we have to assume that either these are blunts or the blow is pulled or what have you. This is a teaching setting here. Note the hand held in reserve, the left hand behind the left hip. That's so that it's loosely held there so it can rapidly shoot forward to create a grapple if needed. There's a handful of plays with the dagger. Cal is actually the only one of the German masters to explicitly show using this slicing counter against a strike. And he shows this done underneath from below against the high attack, and in turn slicing down against a low attack. And he seems to be doing this with a bit of retreating footwork. He looks like he has passed back with the left foot to do this, allowing for additional safety. And it's really surprising that more German masters don't show this. This technique is super easy to do and very conservative and safe. He then goes at the last section into a fairly substantial section of grappling, wrestling, ringen in German. And he has this wonderful set of plays called the 4 hip wrestlings. They all involve hip throws or leveraging the hips in some way. Each of them is supplied with a counter. This is the first one that is done at the neck. He works his way down from the neck to the shoulder, to the elbow, and then to the thigh, the upper thigh. And so we see the technique itself. And here's where you have to be very careful interpreting things, because in this section, Paulus Cal always wins. So he is shown doing the technique, but also shown doing what would be the counter technique to it. I teach this little subsystem of hip wrestlings to folks here. It's always a popular one. It's a fun little system within the system.
So you were saying, Christian, then that those 2 images there, Cal has switched roles. So
Correct.
he is both of the figures. So it's not that the technique was being done on the opposite person that we thought. It is that the technique was being done by, Cal in blue there, and then he's switching roles with the other person and showing the counter again.
Exactly. Can't trust these guys to show it.
One thing, I can see a little like a grayed out figure especially on the left one over the right side of the grappler's shoulder. Is this just bleed through from the paper, or is this perhaps a palimpsest?
No, it is bleed through.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's there. The bleed through is complicated in a couple of ways. There's the lighting that's used to take pictures of manuscripts like this tends to exaggerate the bleed through, because it's lighting through the relatively thin paper or parchment. I believe this is a paper manuscript. Some of them are on parchment. So you're not just seeing what bleed through there would be if you were flipping through the manuscript yourself. It's aggravated sometimes by the particular lighting. But yes, it is bleed through. Moving on from Paulus Cal, we spoke, I mentioned his name before, Hans Leichtenauer. And Leichtenauer took Liechtenauer's verse for unarmored longsword fighting, expanded upon it, made some changes to it, and created a mammoth treatise on fighting with the Messer. There's something like 400 techniques in it or something. It's a huge book. There's 2 editions of it, one from 1478, and then a follow-on illustrated one from 1482. They're very similar. There's a few changes he made between the 2. Leichtenauer was a priest, incidentally. We don't know if he turned to the priesthood late in life and had been a soldier previously. I don't have a lot of biographical material on him yet, but there are illustrations for almost every technique. And the illustrations are in many ways a cautionary tale. It's really unclear when you flip through a book like Leichtenauer, so large as it is, how literal we should take each of the images. And I say this because there are cases where there are contradictions between the illustration and the image, or at least seeming contradictions. They may be accurate enough for the symbolic message intended, but if you were to try to look at them as a photograph-like instruction for how to do the technique, you might come up short. This particular technique shown here is text and image accord very well, but there are others where the text says to step out towards your right, but the figure drawn seems to be stepping across the line to the opponent's right. Whether this is a mistake on the part of the artist or trying to create some prominence for the victor of the technique is difficult to say. Again, we are still in the process of learning how to interpret medieval art, particularly where action is intended. But the take-home message is, if you've got text, substantial text, and illustrations, the text should always have primacy. This is my favorite. As I posted on Facebook recently, this technique has actually been demonstrated in modern times. Liechtenauer includes a number of techniques that he admits are for show, just really showing off in in non-lethal situation. And in this case, the guy gets grappled and put into a sack. Now, a little digression here. In my recent Facebook post, I took the image, but omitted the text above, and I labeled the figures from left to right: Hans, Jörg, Christian, and Peter. So the story behind this was Western Martial Arts Workshop 2005. And it was the first time I got to meet my friend and collaborator, Jörg Bellinghausen, and his friend from the same school, Hans Hind, was also coming over. Some of you may have met these folks. I think Devin has. Jörg wanted to pull a prank on me, where at the high feast, I would be grabbed by he and Hans and put into this burlap sack. Well, Hans preempted him and got in touch with the organizers and said, oh, I will also need, he had a list of things he was going to need. Oh, and I will need a large sack in which to put Jörg. So Hans and Jörg do this very lovely messer fighting demo at the feast. And suddenly, Hans drops his messer, grabs Jörg, carries him like a football down the length of the hall, and to Jörg's horror, his eyes met Peter Kautz and myself holding the sack. Jörg was then thrown into the sack, trussed up, and deposited at the high table, much like Errol Flynn's Robin Hood dropping off his deer he's killed before Prince John. So, folks, it really happened.
That's so funny.
It's such a shame there's no video of it. We must have laughed for 15 minutes straight. And another illustrated book, very late in the 15th century, probably right around 1490. This is somebody we know a bit about as well. Peter Faulkner was a member and sometime captain, Hauptmann, of the famous Marxbruder fencing guild, sanctioned by the Holy Roman Emperor in the 1470s as having the right to name masters of the longsword. And Faulkner has quite a bit of longsword fighting. He's got a very substantial messer section, both of those derived from, respectively, from Liechtenauer and Liechtenauer. A wonderful dagger section that has pretty good illustrations and substantial text. Staff, halberd, some more of the crazy dueling shields, and a little bit of mounted combat. And again, there's bits and pieces of the verse from both Liechtenauer and Liechtenauer accompanying the longsword of messer. He's really has a lot more focus on the messer than the longsword. Blood included here, by the way. You can see this guy's getting beamed on the head with a technique known as the Gefahrhau, which means the endangering stroke. And it is used against someone forming a low guard, and there's a bit of tricky timing to it, used to make them jump first, essentially, allowing them to miss their parry and allowing you to hit them in the forehead with the edge of the messer. Here's the aforementioned dagger section I spoke of, and there's some really great stuff here. Some nice disarms, some good takedowns. And again, you can see this has paragraphs, not just captions, paragraphs, and fairly useful illustrations. There's not a lot of staff fighting detailed in the German fighting manuscripts. Other than Faulkner, there's really only one other 15th century source. He's got, I think, six techniques for this. You can see at right, that's about to be a collar takedown. Nice section on the Poleaxe. And, for a while there were folks that were very pedantic about, well, that's the Poleaxe material. We can't use that for halberd fighting. Peter Faulkner puts the lie to that by saying, well, if you have a poleaxe or a halberd or, whatever, then you can go ahead and use these techniques. So he's basically telling us a pole arm is a pole arm as far as the basics go. You can see even there's differing morphology here. There's something that is a hammer face with the combatant at the far left being countered by somebody that has something that looks more like a crescent-bladed poleaxe or a small halberd, depending on your point of view. He has a bit here too of mounted combat, very clearly deriving from the glosses we have for Liechtenauer's Rossfechten. So kind of, kind of crude artwork, but sort of charming in its own way, and a lot of good data from Falcon. Now, I alluded before that there is material that is definitely German, but how much it's related to Liechtenauer's own art is questionable. A series of armored combat manuscripts known as the Gladiatoria group. The copy in Krakow is explicitly titled Gladiatoria. The others are untitled. This is one of the earlier variations on that family of manuscripts. My own suspicion is that this material got grafted into the Liechtenauer tradition, which has only some, initially in the verse, only some very basic advice on how to fight in armor with a sword or a spear. This goes into all sorts of specific techniques, dozens and dozens of them. And those seem to creep into the later manuscripts as being ways to gloss the verse in greater detail. So my own suspicion is that these starts off a little bit separate or a parallel or an offshoot, and then it gets fully integrated in later. Earliest of these is 1425 or 1430, somewhere around there. The really beautifully illustrated one in Krakow today is probably around 1440, 1445, somewhere there. Here again, kind of going back and forth here, notice again, no gauntlets illustrated. And, we see flesh color there, so we know it's, those are bare hands illustrated. And I think again, that's a cheat. Once we have to show that relatively well-known technique of thrusting in behind the gauntlet, you have to draw them. Now here the artist has been kind enough to show the one executing the action also wearing gauntlets. Here's another bad scan I really need to replace with a nice color image I have now. This is an uncaptioned, no text at all for this one, showing armored combat right around 1440. Again, we don't know where this fits in the puzzle. There's no text to tell us. It is interesting at this late date, we see these humongous wheel pommels on the swords they're wearing and using. So very interesting. The type of breastplate they're wearing is called a Kastenbrust, which basically means it's a box breast. So you have this very boxy kind of profile to the chest defense there. Fairly comprehensive armor though at this point. We're really very little gaps left now to attack, so you really have to use precision thrusting to get into those areas that are still defended only by mail. More from that same manuscript, they're each fighting with the half sword or shortened sword, as some manuscripts call it, looking for gaps in the armor with the swords. Then there's outright mysterious things. This is one from Switzerland, again, someplace in the mid-15th century. We don't understand at all how this fits into the puzzle. Wording is quite different. The technical terms, very little overlap. It may be a complete and utterly separate tradition, but some interesting stuff in there. Same thing here with the von Baumann's Fechtbuch, which is actually 3 separate fight books later bound together from different periods in the 15th century. Most people know this online as Codex Wallerstein. That is a name I'm trying to wean people off of, because calling it Codex Wallerstein is like calling one of Mark Twain's book the Library of Congress book. There are 1,600 manuscripts that came out of the Wallerstein Autendisch collection and are now in the Augsburg State Library in Germany. So Codex Wallerstein just is a little imprecise, especially when you realize that 7 out of those 1,600 are fight books. So you can't even call it the Wallerstein fight book. There is a name, von Baumann's, in the first sheet of the book as it is bound today. And at the time we think the binding occurred, there was a Michael von Baumann's, who was a well-known mercenary operating out of Augsburg. It may have been in his personal collection at some point. So this is a dagger technique. This section of the manuscript has longsword, dagger, and messer. There is an extremely large wrestling treatise that Jess Finley's working on right now. She's doing translation work on that right now, which is very exciting. And then a very early version, very early piece that might be from the 1420s, alas with no captions, but seems to show very early clothing and earlier weapons. Once we get into the 16th century, the manuscript tradition is not dead. This is an illustrated gloss of Ringex's teachings. This is from a 1508, very well documented dating on that one. That's held in the Glasgow Museum's collections. Unfortunately, the first third of Ringex's unarmored gloss is missing from it. The manuscript is not complete. But there's, and this is again a compendium. There's all sorts of other fight information in there. A very substantial wrestling treatise in there as well. This is Versengloss once again from a partially illustrated manuscript called Goliath, because there's an allegorical illustration of David defeating Goliath that begins the book. So yeah, there, Devin, there's a little bit of allegorical stuff tucked in. Not quite a bird-headed guy, but another example of using allegory. So here again, we have the verse and the gloss explaining the Krumpow, dated somewhere around 1515, maybe 1520. Again, there are some illustrations in this of fairly high caliber. Some mounted combat from the same one. Again, I really should supplement this PowerPoint with the color versions now that those are available. Again, I dug this back out of the archives from a decade and a half ago. Foot combat, not too many illustrations of that, unfortunately, from this one, but this is a technique that is done when someone is thrusting up from below at you. You thrust down over the back of their hand to jam their attack, and then turn your sword so that you can find a gap in their armor to thrust to. This poor schmuck on the left is about to get it in the groin. All fun and games till you get thrust in the groin. This is an illustrated work with some text by Jörg Wilhelm. Again, we're getting farther into the 16th century now, 1520s. Probably, this dating here may be a little optimistically early. It may be as late as 1530. And we start seeing printed works. This is from right around we're about to go into the 1530s. The Alten Fester, the ancient fighter. So it's a record of earlier techniques, albeit with some garbling, but this was printed, and lots of copies of this survive in all kinds of museums and private collections. So here we see some messer fighting happening. Again, the tradition is starting to change now. It is the province of the wealthy, the aristocratic fighting class in the 15th century. Moving into the 16th century, print allows it to be disseminated much more widely. And as the knightly class is waning in influence on the battlefield, professional soldiers and levies raised from the guilds, the trade guilds of cities, become more important. They're beginning to use this not only for training for actual fighting, but a stronger and stronger sportive quality is also appearing. We find the Fechtbuch, these public fencing schools or fight demonstrations, becoming more and more prominent in the cities, the big cities like Augsburg and Vienna, Innsbruck have these contests that are attended by much pageantry. Shooting matches become associated with them as well. If you want to read much more about this, I have to recommend Anne Slusty's book on the martial ethic in early modern Germany. A lot of fascinating stuff on this subject in there. This is part of a gigantic compendium created by Paulus Hector Meyer in the 1540s. Meyer is the earliest documented HEMA geek. We don't have a lot of evidence to suggesting that he was, well, certainly not a fencing master and probably a dilettante and dabbler, but was fascinated by this stuff. He owned many of the 15th century surviving treatises at one time or another, spending money on that, and he spent a king's ransom creating this huge, what he thought would be a be-all and end-all of fencing with just about any kind of weapon you can imagine. Various versions of this work appeared. One of them is in Latin, one's in German. lot of, commissioned very high-end artists to do the accompanying artwork. Well, Paul Hector Meyer had lots of vices. He lived in a very large house, collected all sorts of valuable things, produced these extremely expensive fencing manuscripts. Where did he get the money for that? Well, he was the city treasurer of Augsburg, and he was skimming money out of the treasury. Ultimately, this was discovered, and he was convicted and hung. So I would say that's probably the delineating line there between going too far for your hobby. So kids, don't try this at home. This is a wonderful illustration of a judicial duel. That is a piece of one of the manuscripts he had created. You can imagine just what it cost to commission this piece of art, let alone the rest of all these specific fighting techniques. It's quite a wondrous picture in and of itself. Late in the 16th century, we find Joachim Meyer, who produced a very modern-like instruction book for fighting with the weapons of the German manuscripts that they cover. The tradition is changing a bit, but Meyer also knows when to be a traditionalist. He shows his chops that he knows the Liechtenauer tradition as it was 100 years ago, before his time, but is adjusting things as he goes. He talks about how thrusts are we don't really use thrusts anymore except against the common foe. In other words, it's not good form for Germans to thrust each other with long swords at this point. I suspect that was honored more in the breach than in the customary, but at least it's a sentiment he gives. Here he's showing various postures, techniques that he refers back to these in his text to these plates. This is obviously the longsword. These are practice longswords. We can tell they have the very wide flaring secondary parrying defense called the shield, that flaring at the base of the blade. And we see very obvious late 16th century German costume here with the flared pants and the puffs and slashes and the doublets that they're wearing. It's obviously shown in a not realistic fighting setting. There's a real vogue for neoclassicism arising in the 16th century that lasts well into the 17th and beyond. So this is almost a classical setting that our fencers are shown in, rather than a 16th century German fencing salon. He includes fighting with the dagger. You can see these are practice daggers with these little balls on the end to prevent thrusts from actually happening. All kinds of grapples, arm bars, and things being shown here. Again, in his text, he'll refer to, look at plate A at the figure at upper left, to see what I'm talking about. So he calls out each of these figures. Now, where thrusting does happen, certainly in Meyer's time, is what he calls a rapier, spelled with two P's. But this is something between what modern collectors would call a cut and thrust sword versus a strictly thrusting optimized longer rapier. So Meyer is taking the longsword and Messer teachings and really spinning that into a way of fighting with this weapon. But he's got quite a bit of Italian influence in here too. He doesn't call out Renaissance Italy specifically, but he says the rapier is a weapon, not natural or originating with us Germans, so we have to look to some foreigners to help inform some of them. Interesting confession.
It's also one of the few manuals where we actually have the term rapier being used.
Yes, that is really interesting, isn't it? Right, because it's just a sword elsewhere, right?
Yeah, in most of the rapier manuals, it's not called a rapier.
Yeah, yeah. What does Fabris call it? I have him right on my shelf here, but
He just calls it a sword.
Just a sword, yeah.
Yep.
It makes you really wonder then.
Or yeah, science.
It makes you really wonder then, because of course we associate the Italian rapier or the Spanish rapier, but maybe the term really does come from Germany. Getting into the 17th century, this is 1612. This is Jakob Suter, who really is basically taking Meyer's teachings and streamlining it. But look, even at this late date, what do we find? Ox, Flug, Alber, and Vom Tag, or Vom Tag and Alber, if I go in the right order in the illustrations. The four guards. still have that prominence, even at this late date, long after Liechtenauer's bones have molded in the ground. Some people you'll read about Suter as Meyer's plagiarist. The idea of plagiarizing fencing manuscripts was kind of an alien idea then. You inherited teachings and you continued to spread them. So I would call him an inheritor rather than a plagiarist. And here, Suter is fighting with the Dusak, which is sort of the somewhat of the successor to the Messer. These were practice weapons, but also there were steel versions of these, usually with complex guards that were swords and actual swords in their own right, not just training tools. And here we have the rapier again, and a thrust. It's weird to read this, you know, a thrust with the rapier from left ox. And that's kind of our tour there. There is a late 17th century redaction of the tradition by Verolini, but I haven't looked at that much. But I think that is 1680, 1679, 1680. But it's basically following along, you know, Meyer and Suter's footsteps. So that's enough of my jawing along with slides. What questions can I answer for folks after this dizzying tour across more than 200 years?
Christian, I wanted to know, why do you think that these masters kept such a strong association to Liechtenauer when we see a lot of other manuals where they don't make any firm attributions to who their masters were, what tradition that they were in? Was it just that Liechtenauer had a good brand? Or is there something greater to, you know, like we see in Cal, this idea that there might be this brotherhood of Liechtenauer masters?
It's a really good question, and I think, it's a hard one to answer, right? Because the first thing one would leap at would be, well, Liechtenauer must have been really awesome, and it was, you know, achieved this legendary status, but without finding any biographical data on you know, his personal prowess, the continuity, I think, just has to somehow have something to do with some of these masters being fairly tight with each other in some way. The way Cal lists them all, the way we see a number of the ones he lists actually part of the von Danzig book. You know, so their teachings travel together in a lot of ways. You know, my presentation today was wide sweeping, but nothing close to exhaustive. I could call up, you know, a good another dozen of ones from the late 15th and even more in the 16th century, where we see these materials copied over and over and over again. So they must have just had, I guess it is a good brand, but I think the first and second generation of inheritors of it must have just been really good at being fairly tight and making sure their teachings were replicated enough. Now, the other thing that comes into this too is you're taking a guess at this, right? Looking at just what we think survives from the Middle Ages. My guess is that conservatively, we could say, you know, for whatever we have surviving now, there probably was, you know, it's probably 10% of what existed originally. You know, we've had you know, wars of religion. We've had, you know, the Franco-Prussian War. We've had two incredibly destructive world wars that ravaged Europe. You know, we know somehow the Ringek manuscript, which is actually from around 1500 or so, somehow that survived being in Dresden, but we know lots of medieval material was destroyed in the fire bombings of Dresden by the British. So there has to have been an awful lot more too, which raises the question, were there even more Liechtenauer manuscripts? Were there competitive traditions that we have no record of now? It's very difficult to say. And you know, a lot of it is selected about where things survived. Paulus Cal, for instance, survived in Landshut, which is where his ducal patron was based, and then was much later transferred to Munich. So that was fortunate to survive. We have other ones that, you know, like one of the early Taulfers that's still in the same family castle that his patron was. So I think it's probably a matter of of, how close were the students of Liechtenauer and what they showed, how good of patrons were they able to secure that made their material survive. Probably a lot of things that contribute to where we are. I think I'm answering you by not answering you, but.
Well, thanks, Christian. Yeah, it's just interesting to think where we have, I just think of in a lot of the Italian traditions, they often will allude to other teachings or even to other masters, but they won't give their names. It's pretty exceptional that their names are given. And my sense of that is that they're trying to make their own name and not distract from their own name by attributing that, their teachings to somebody else, because they're trying to keep the attention on themselves. And I just think it's interesting that a lot of these, as you mentioned in Talhofer, he seems to even in his second or third, I can't remember which, he then goes back to actually bring in the Zettel. And so it seems more like he's, you sort of said he wants to show that he still has the art. Why was it so important to him when he published to show his connection to Liechtenauer, as opposed to trying to purely stand on his own, which he certainly, at least of the various masters we have from that time period, seems to have the most capacity to do? Why was it so important for him to maintain that connection to Liechtenauer?
So I think in Germany, one distinction we can draw is certainly in the 15th century. You said an interesting word, published, and of course these manuscripts were not published; they were made for someone. So probably the names of the antecedents are known in those noble circles already. When we get into the 16th century, right, and we have printed works that are really finding mass distribution, at least to an extent. Making your own name probably has a different cachet than approaching a noble patron and saying, why should you have me train your troops? Well, because I trained with this guy, who you've probably heard of. So maybe that might be part of it. The counter to that, I'd say, is it's almost odd that Vadi doesn't mention Fiore, right? Since his treatise obviously owes an awful lot there. And instead, Vadi takes some pains to say, well, this is my new footwork. This is a new iteration of, the art, right? So he's not doing a callback to what should be at least as far as we can see, should be a fairly obvious antecedent, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Of course, Fiore doesn't mention any of the German or Italian masters that he studied with. He just simply states that he has studied with them. So that's interesting as well.
Yeah, well, but in all fairness, in the only shred of biographical data we have in manuscript 3227A, the so-called Dobringer one, shouldn't have called that, but that's where it says, Liechtenauer, he traveled through many countries, and it lists them, Poland and blah, blah, blah. It's a bunch of countries, but it doesn't list any names of anybody that he studied with. Fiore mentions Johannes Surenus and Nicholas, von Tobler, right? But we don't know who those guys are. In fact, as Greg and company's research shows, it's hard to nail down exactly even where they're from. What are these locations they're even talking about? So yeah, Fiore does mention a couple people, but not too much about them.
Yeah, his students, he's giving that side of his credibility. And is there I know there's a house book is one of the earliest books that mentions Liechtenauer. Does it give any more detail?
That's the one I'm talking about. That's the so-called Dobringer. It's I don't know. I started calling it the Nuremberg House Book until I found out that there's another Nuremberg House Book that doesn't have fencing. So it needs a better name. But yeah, that is a house book. Now that's the one that a lot of folks tried to date to 1389. That's almost certainly the wrong date. 1389 is the earliest date in a liturgical calendar covering, I forget how many years, 50 years or something, that's included in the house book. But those kind of liturgical calendars were usually stock items that would be good for X number of years and would get recycled over and over. You can't take it's like finding somebody's checkbook and finding the first year on it is 1991 and the last one is 1994 and trying to figure out which date is right. So that doesn't really tell us a whole lot. I actually think that that one is not 14th century, as I earlier mentioned. I think it's 15th century. I've corresponded with, you familiar with Cliff Rogers, who wrote War, Cruel and Sharp about Edward III?
Yeah.
Cliff has been researching gunpowder recipes and looking at the one that is in that house book, because it has all kinds of crazy formulae, herbalism, astrology, all sorts of stuff. He says there's no way that's a 14th century gunpowder recipe. It's 15th century, probably right around 1425 rather. And but Jess has looked at it and looked at the way it's written, and she actually thinks it's late 15th century because its style of writing is very similar to some hunting and falconry manuscripts she's looked at that are firmly dated later in the century. So yeah, who knows? But I'm pretty darn sure these days it's not 14.
Thank you.
That's the one that talks about, that he traveled and studied and all that stuff.
So there's a question here. Ooh, there's an echo.
Coming from the void.
There's a question here from Wes von Papineau. That's because
Yeah, I think you've got
I've got a
two.
TV on here. He said, can somebody please ask for me, what's the most important thing that you do not know about Liechtenauer himself or the Liechtenauer tradition and needs the most research/interpretive work?
Yeah, that's a really
What
good question.
you don't know.
I think the thing that's unclear the most is what was the social standing of these guys? There was speculation years ago that Ringek was somehow attached to the nobility. I think that's unlikely, but there are places in Europe where for many years, being a fencing master was practically like being a trash collector. They really were regarded it almost in the same dismissiveness as entertainers and actors. However, if you look at somebody like Paulus Cal, who commanded troops, and I really should have talked more about Paulus Cal. Let me talk a little bit about him because he's really interesting. He worked for Ludwig the Rich from 1450 to 1479. That's a 29-year gig. And he worked for one of the other Bavarian nobles for some years before he got that gig. And for both those nobles, he commanded troops, miners, sappers, artillerymen. He was such a right-hand guy to Ludwig. He was given charge of collecting tolls in and out of a couple ports of the duchy, was entrusted with gobs of cash to go on gem buying expeditions for the ducal household, acted as a diplomatic escort and ambassador. This guy was a made man. Now, I doubt he was ennobled, but he certainly was not low class, and he probably became fairly wealthy doing this. Was that true of Liechtenauer himself? Or, we know Talhofer served some high-profile people, trained household troops. So they obviously had some social standing, but exactly what that was is unclear. And it's all the more unclear because knighthood in Germany is complicated. Certainly up until the 14th century, we have a class of German knights known as ministeriales. And they are basically knightly serfs. They are owned by nobles, even though they are knights in a way. And then we have the Ritter class, which means nothing more than rider. And it's not to say that the ministeriales didn't ride, they did. But those were more nobility. Was somebody like Liechtenauer a late period ministeriales type of person who was a knight in a way and knew knightly combat? Obviously, he knew knightly combat. He knows armored combat, so he's not some poor guy. But the exact social place of these people is really difficult to determine. And it's hard to do the research on it because there's just so little data on them, period. That's one I'd like to know. Does that answer?
Sorry, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What is, in your opinion, when you look at like the German kind of swordsmanship history with all the manuscripts and all the students and all the masters, is there something that is is the most interesting like historical crossover that you've noticed? like where someone showed up in one manual, but they were mentioned somewhere else, but they were also a historical figure or something like that. Like anything that kind of was an interesting story.
Well, so I would have answered that question 6 months ago, radically different than the way I'm going to answer it now. I'm working on another, if any of you have seen my book in St. George's name, it's an anthology. I'm working on a second anthology right now. And a late addition to it is a chapter called In Play and in Earnest, Maximilian I and the Kunst des Fechten, the art of fencing. Having attended the Metropolitan Museum's recent exhibition on Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, straddling the 15th and 16th centuries, and looking more closely at the semi-autobiographical works he commissioned, it became really clear that he studied this art. And there are illustrations in some of his works that I could show you that map uncannily to some of the images I've shown you from these manuscripts. So this is one of the most important historic players of the period, who was clearly immersed in this. In fact, apparently, he, like many of his grandiose plans, he had an unfulfilled plan to create his own Fechtbuch that he would author and have artwork commissioned for. So there's a huge tie-in between his training as a youth and the type of foot combats he did in the tournaments he attended that are one-to-one tie-ins. So that's really fascinating stuff.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you know what? If you guys want, I'm finishing up a presentation that I'm going to do for the Seelahar Fechtschule instructors. I'll probably be getting in the next few weeks. But it's just about Maximilian and his tie-ins with this stuff. If you guys want to see something like that down the road, I'd be happy to show you that at some point too. It's really cool.
Oh yeah, definitely. We'd totally be interested.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Sorry, I'd like to ask a question. And so did all method is using one hand? Because I noticed that there's a kind of method called Creek method that is using two hands. So I just feel curious about it.
Yes, the Messer treatises that we have are for one-handed use. And I would go on to say that basically the curriculum for the Messer is the curriculum for single-handed swords, period. And in fact, Talhofer has a few plays with the buckler where he is referring to, here's Messer and buckler, but a couple of the illustrations actually show an army sword, single-handed army sword. My own experience, I don't know if you can see in the background, but there are Messers, single and two-handed there. When I play with two-handed Messers, or I have a Swiss saber reproduction as well, they fight like longswords, with some little bit of adaptations in that you don't have a full back edge. But other than that, it's a longsword.
Oh, okay.
Kind of a sneaky longsword, because there's a couple techniques where you can kind of snake around a defense by utilizing that subtle curve that the Kriegsmesser has.
Oh, I see. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
We've got a question for you.
Please.
This may be a bit late period for you, but in the texts you work with, do you know of any direct or indirect references to either the Reformation or the Wars of Religion?
No, there's no, the fight books seem to keep the politics out of it, other than, having lugubrious compliments to the patron that it's dedicated to. So we don't see that. Now, what we do see a little bit of a hint of is, so this whole manuscript tradition in the 15th century has lots of overlap, and this is something I talk about sometimes too. So we have Fechtbuch, we have fight books, fencing books. We have Kriegsbücher, which are military equipment books. There's a very famous treatise by Conrad Kaiser, written in 1405, which is about siegecraft. And it has all kinds of devices for breaching walls, for mining, for even some primitive diving suits for traversing moats and things like that. It was much copied. And Talhofer includes pieces of that treatise in at least two of his fight books. So we have this overlap there. Now, part of what you see in that as well, that kind of siege equipment and battle equipment sort of stuff, you'll see some hints of influence from the Bohemians, the religious rebels led by Jan Hus, the Hussites, and the wars that occurred in the 1440s and beyond between them and the imperial forces. And you see like their war wagons depicted. So there's a little bit of hint at religious strife there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Hi, I also have a question. Speaking more again on the time period, I think you mentioned around early 16th century, more fencing schools began to become more commonplace. And I was wondering, I might have missed it, but I was wondering if there was any particular reason that you might know of why in Germany that started to occur.
Okay, so in that context, fencing school, a Fechtschule, at least in that 16th century context, is not a physical school. It is actually an event that happens. Now, why do I think this happens? Cities are becoming centers of power. People are moving out of the country into the cities. The craft guilds are becoming very powerful. You have a rising burgher class. And these people in many ways want to emulate the aristocracy. So you have a larger pool of people wanting to show off sword fighting skills. So these contests are held. They are very rules bound. There's no thrusts allowed, very limited grapples. The idea in most of these is to draw a not lethal but a bleeding wound as high in the body as possible. Prizes are given out. Competitions are held between the different guilds. So it's becoming a popular sport is what's happening. It's not limited anymore towards noble households being trained, aristocrats being trained to fight duels or warfare. It's becoming a pastime, and there's a degree of idea of being used to keep the populace trained for warfare. But when you read the military theorists of the time, they don't tend to take the guild militias terribly seriously. They're okay for putting down some minor trouble. They're also good for starting a lot of local trouble. There's a lot of brawling that starts coming out of this too. And Plusky's book talks a lot about that, about civil unrest arising from fencing. Same thing happens with, pardon me, allergy season. Part of the attached to this too are these shooting contests, which actually outlast the fencing contests. Target shooting, winning prizes for shooting accuracy and such.
Okay, thank you. That was very informative.
Certainly. Anyone else?
Christian, do any of the manuals you studied mention the other skills disciplines that should be studied by a warrior or noble warrior? I know that there are some manuals that talk about like leaping, throwing, some of these other sort of physical skills. How much of those mentioned within the Liechtenauer fight books?
Well, in the aforementioned house book, I believe there's some talk about general athletic prowess, not too specific. We certainly do see those connections in non-technical sources that show longsword fencing along with stone casting, dancing, archery, wrestling, etc. So there's not a lot of it mentioned in the technical sources, just a little bit of oblique mention. There certainly is mention though about courage and moral compass. That the aforementioned house book talks about wanting to do things in a your fighting should have a courtly quality to it. Something that shows that you are a noble in a way doing this. So that's certainly in there. There's not explicit reference to go be a good dancer first before you do it, which I'm very relieved at, being a highly mediocre dancer myself.
Thanks so much, Christian.
I have a question.
Certainly.
So in one of the earlier slides, you mentioned that to start a duel, they would throw a spear. Is that correct? Yeah,
Yep.
and I'm trying to wrap my head around it. Like, why a spear? It's kind of impractical. You don't use it for killing it. If you throw it in front of you, you might trip on it, especially if you're in armor. And why don't you just throw a glove or something a lot easier to start a duel with?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that because I did forget to mention that. So you might recall late in the presentation, I showed a slide or two from Gladiatoria, that family of armored combat ones. There's a really wonderful plate in that basically shows following the letter of the law, you must cast something, but not wanting to give up your very valuable spear, which is really good for delivering powerful thrusts into the caps of the armor. So the combatant has a gimmicky longsword with a pommel that unscrews. So it shows him hucking the pommel at his opponent to clear that requirement in the rules. There, I threw something. Now I'm going to stab with my spear.
That's amazing.
That kind of raises more questions for me. Like, why would you throw your pommel?
Well, so assuming your sword's hilt is secured independently, which most of them were, and a lot of modern sword construction requires the pommel to create tension for the grip itself between the pommel and the cross. There are other ways of building up a grip so that the pommel is not needed to keep the grip intact. So yeah, you know what? You can still hit them poleaxe like with the cross guard on the sword. You can still go into that half sword grip and thrust with it without the pommel being on there. And you haven't given up your very valuable spear by being the one required to huck something.
Sir, Wes here. I don't know if you can hear me. I just had a 12-year-old teach me how to use this.
Oh, hey, Wes.
Oh, sir, can I bring you back, sir, to your slide, which shows Liechtenauer's patron cutting the throat of somebody? It's about 1/3 of the way through your briefing.
Cutting the throat.
It's from Cal. It's Wes, I think you're talking about the one where he showing the end of the judicial duel.
Yes, yes, sir.
Oh, it's Talhopper. All right.
Could you please bring that up?
Certainly can. Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to lead us into what I always get beaten up at the cell about double hits, but there's something else I'd like to bring you back to.
Oh, let me go find that very slide.
Sorry about this.
No, quite all right. I'm here to serve.
Okay, that's the one. Now,
Yep.
sir, you skipped over. Okay, you were very kind in showing that the patron is shown as the victor, but the slide to the left shows him taking a groin or a femoral hit. Now, yes, the loser is definitely losing, but it seems like the victor is also taking a blow in return. And this to me is the archetypical double hit. And why would Liechtenauer depict his patron as being wounded when doing something else? And there's also part B to this.
So this probably is a cautionary tale, right? So if we look at the image on the left where the guy in the ground's hand is not secured, right? Versus the one on the right where you could almost argue the knee is constraining the dagger hand. And he's got him much more splayed out there. One on the left is the unsafe conclusion. One on the right is the safe conclusion, I would argue.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, we definitely see places, particularly Talhopper, and this is from Talhopper, not Liechtenauer himself. Talhopper has a number of places where he shows actions that seem to be cautionary tales. There's one illustration in his long sword material, and I try to point this out to people all the time. It's a thing where one opponent is doing a one-handed whipping attack to the opponent's leg, but is not out of danger from a strike from above by his opponent. I think that is actually a cautionary tale there too.
Thank you, sir. Now, just I wish I could put the two slides up together. You talked later about the inside sword taken and the terminology. He didn't use disarm. I like the term sword not taken. because it shows everybody armed with a dagger. Just because you've taken my sword, you have not disarmed me. The fight is not over, sir.
Right. Yep. Yep. And it also implies, I believe, that you are gaining control of their sword. You'd like it to come out of their hands, certainly. That's the optimum outcome. But seizing it in and of itself has value. Getting control.
Yes. Yes, sir, but we see indications where people teach you how to take a sword with a dagger, not successfully done most of the times, but just because you've lost your sword, you're not yet disarmed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Sir.
Yeah, there was considerable debate about that online a while ago about how, well, we don't have any evidence that assuming unarmored longsword duels happened in Germany, that they ever involved daggers. I put that discussion to rest by showing a picture from the von Baumann's that has a panoply, a big 2-page spread showing an unarmored longsword duel about to happen. And indeed, both combatants have walked into the list wearing daggers. So it happened.
Speaking of that plate again, the pommel hook one from the Rostfechten, I've interpreted that one. I think it says it's the inside. I can't remember what you called it, but the
inside sword taking, yeah.
Inside sword taking. I interpret that one as an inside sword taking because it actually starts from an inside crossing, because the pommel hook actually happens on the outside of the wrist in that plate. So it's like you've got, you start with the sword crossed on the inside, and as you yield, that makes the outside of the wrist available to get the pommel over.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put that. Huh. Okay.
Because if you look at that, their hands are crossed on the outside by the time they conclude. But although the pommel is on the inside of the other guy's wrist, so that.
Yeah, that's my only pause with that, interpreting that way. But I don't know, Jen. Let me look at the text, the more detailed text from the commentaries on that, and see where the stress is added on, because both the inside and outside ones are discussed in the mainstream commentaries. So let me have a look at that for you, because that's really curious. Actually, let me see if I can pull one up quick. Stop sharing for a second here. Oh, you know what? Hang on. Pull my translation right here. Let's see how quickly I can find something in my own book.
It was absolutely awesome when Jess brought your translation and we got to try these things on horseback, because the words make such a difference.
Yeah, she was so excited about working with you on that. She was really jazzed. All right, I will have to dig this out. I will drop you a message on this though.
Oh, sure, thanks.
But that's really interesting. Yeah, is it named after where you start or where you finish?
Yeah.
And the other question too is that rendering even consistent between the masters? It may not be. That's really tricky too, because the way you think of inside and outside, for instance, with half sword thrusting is a little counterintuitive to how you would think about a sword stroke. So. All right, any other questions?
I made an observation when early on in your slides when you were talking about von Kozeg. And then you mentioned his little coat of arms on the bottom there. And he, that Koenigsegg was from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
There's a gentleman by the name of Christian von Koenigsegg from Sweden who still uses that coat of arms, and produces sports cars. And he uses that coat of arms on the front of his car.
Oh,
so like as soon as I saw that, I was like, that can't be the same coat of arms, but it was. So
it may be. He may be a descendant. I was just reading you know, the Habsburg family, even though they're not in power anymore, there's still a titular Duke of, Duke of Bavaria. Well, actually, no, excuse me, it's the Wittelsbach family, but one of the Habsburg descendants who doesn't advertise it, but he's a prince of the house, but he's like a race car driver or something. So yeah, you find the descendants of some of these longtime noble families in all sorts of places, and certainly we know some German nobles moved to Scandinavia, particularly during the wars of religion, depending on what side they ended up on and all that. So it's not that surprising. Yeah, he probably is a scion of that family. Very possible.
Yeah. The only thing that makes the big connection is the coat of arms. So, and I remember him watching some interviews with him where he was talking about the coat of arms and using that so that was important to him as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to look him up. That's really interesting. Very cool.
Awesome. Alrighty. I think we're getting close to the end of our time here. So if anyone has one last question for Christian, we can do that, and then we'll wrap it up.
In Fiore's book, he mentions having learned from German masters, and I know that you mentioned that Meyer mentions that the rapier that he does is derived from the Italian in some ways. I was wondering if there's any other acknowledgement or evidence of a crossover from the Italian longsword into the German longsword tradition in any of the manuscripts.
No, not real. Well, I mean, there's evidence of some commonalities, certainly. A couple things here. First, if we eliminated the sword in two hands, from the fighting with the long sword in the two hands, Fiore's tradition and the German arts would be almost indistinguishable. I can find every one of the dagger plays Fiore shows, or something extremely similar in my material, vice versa. And we see things that, common names like frontali, which, some others, some call the crown, which is a guard name we see in the German material. These centers of sword excellence are separated by the Alps and some good roads. So cross-pollination must have been inevitable. There's too many similarities for that to not have been the case. Too much commerce going back and forth between them. Too much reference to the respected masters training in different countries. So my personal feeling is if you saw a really good practitioner of Liechtenauer's art and a really good practitioner of Fiore's art fighting in 1430 or something like that, I think you'd be hard pressed to tell who was who for the most part. So I think there's a lot of cross-pollination. Up until the first third of the 15th century, armor is the same on both sides of the Alps. We have an international style of armor for the most part. So yeah, these are not worlds apart. They are, it's like driving between, a couple large provinces or states on this continent.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
Awesome. All righty.
All right, if you have follow-on questions, I'm easy to find on Facebook, either through my personal profile or my author page. So feel free to hunt me down if you wish. I've really enjoyed presenting this and hearing your questions and fumbling for my answers, and would love to do something again for you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christian. It was a real pleasure to get this nice, thorough presentation, and glad to see your face, even from far away.
Indeed, always a pleasure to see you. Take care. Good to see you, Jen, if you're still on.
I am, and thanks so much. I really enjoyed that.
All right. Hey, if I forget to get that stuff on the disarms to you, bug me. There's a lot on my plate, but I definitely am going to get that to you.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.